Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. The sweeping review of our Navy, with Labor announcing an $11 billion boost to our warship fleet, although it's not really $11 billion. I'll explain that shortly. But what does it mean? And most importantly, with the drums of war beating from the likes of China, are we moving as fast as we should? Just when you think things couldn't get any more absurd, a group of British government health officials have outdone themselves by declaring that a trans woman's milk, so that's milk from a biological male, is just as good as a woman's breast milk for babies. Now, this has gone beyond erasing women's spaces. It's now about erasing women altogether. Plus, we'll speak with the Home Affairs Shadow Minister, James Patterson, on Labor's border protection budget woes. But also, he's just come back from the Munich Security Conference. He's got a lot of concerns about things happening here and there. And of course, these 2,000 visas were granted to people out of Gaza. And yet again, Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill chasing her tail with reports the Albanese government will be forced to pump more money into borders in the upcoming May budget. But what does it take in illegal boat arrival for Labor to realise you can't gut the funding without impacting what happens on our coastline? But first, today's long-awaited naval announcement from the Albanese government. Now, given the state of the world and our region in particular, this announcement has been far too slow coming. Indeed, the Defence Minister has been sitting on a review into our surface fleet since last September. But finally this afternoon, he released a sanitised version of the inquiry's report and announced the government's response. So what's in it? And critically, does it pass muster? Well, the key measures are that the government will keep the anti-submarine frigate program, but reduce the numbers from 9 down to 6. In addition, there'll be 11 new mini frigates that can be built quickly, overseas initially, to give the Navy the firepower it needs, but more swiftly here at home, perhaps, should China threaten Taiwan. Plus, there'll be 6 special missile ships of a new type in reserve for when operationally required. Now, what the government's aiming at is an eventual continuous build of smaller warships in Perth and larger ones in Adelaide. And look, that's fair enough, because we can build naval ships here in Australia reasonably competitively, provided we're always at it without the stop-go, it's called the Valley of Death, the stop-starting programs of the past that have previously bedevilled shipbuilding in this country. So that's what we're getting. The bigger questions out of today are, can we fund it? Can we afford it as taxpayers? And in the end, will it ever get delivered? The Defence Minister today put an extra $1.7 billion on the table. That's real money today. And $11 billion over the decade. Now, if that happens, and it's a big if, that will bring defence spending up to 2.4% of Australia's GDP. Now, 1.7 might sound like a lot of money, and it is, but in the defence portfolio, it's not a lot. And it's the only real money on the table today. Don't get fooled by the $11 billion big number. That's all there in the never, never. Those numbers are not in the budget, meaning they're not yet real. As Greg Sheridan shrewdly observed earlier today, in budget terms, it's all hat and no cowboy. So what about the capability of what the minister's announced today? Is this exactly what we need, given the threat from China to the seas in our north? Well, I can't answer that, because Defence still has to decide between 4 separate designs for this new mini frigate: Spain, Germany, South Korea or Japan. It says it will pick one of them off the shelf, but if that actually happens, it'll be the first time Defence in Australia has resisted the urge to fiddle with any warship it gets from overseas since about the 1960s. And on past form, Defence could still take years, not weeks or months, years, to make up its mind on which overseas design is best. But let's be optimistic for a moment. By about 2040, we should have a much larger and more lethal Navy, provided, of course, we can borrow the money between now and then to pay for it all. Let's hope the communists in Beijing are prepared to wait that long for Australia to be ready. Look, if you thought climate policy was just about reducing carbon dioxide emissions, think again. First, it was about scrapping reliable and affordable coal and gas power in favour of expensive renewables that only deliver electricity when the sun's shining and the wind's blowing. Then it was about forcing you to give up your utes and your four-wheel drives in favour of electric vehicles that aren't very practical outside the inner city suburbs. Well, now it's all about changing what you eat, because our cattle and sheep herds are the main contributors to the agricultural emissions that make up about 10% of Australia's total. You see, to the climate zealots, it's never been about saving the planet. It's been about upending the way we live. It's about forcing us to live what they think is a more moral life. Smaller cars, more public transport, less air travel, unless you're Taylor Swift, and a lot less meat. In short, it's the cultural Marxist agenda about a big state and control. Only this time, not so much about wrecking the economy in the name of equality, but wrecking the economy in the name of saving the planet. The latest madness is this move today from the National Health and Medical Research Council, we know it as the NHMRC, to introduce in dietary guidelines information about environmental sustainability, as if its emissions content in our food helps to determine whether something's good or bad for our diet. As reported in the Australian newspaper today, this could lead to people being told, get your beef and lamb intake down in favour of chicken, not because they're more protein or lower in fat, because supposedly chicken might have a lower carbon footprint. The NHMRC says this change has been driven by, quote, stakeholder feedback. In other words, our chief medical science body has been bullied by activists into changing the official advice to make what you eat about climate change as well as about your health. The Red Meat Advisory Council, well, they've just gone out today and it described all of this as ideological, an agenda being pushed at the expense of the latest nutritional science. First, your power bill, they were after that, then the car you drive, now it's a porterhouse on your plate. And these green progressives want to call this progress. And look, speaking of madness, how about this? In Britain, there's now official advice from the University of Sussex Hospital's National Health Service Trust that the chest secretions of biological men are just as nutritious as a mother's breast milk. Now, in order to lactate, a biological man must be on heavy doses of several artificial hormones. So the idea that the secretions that result could be just the same as a mother's natural breast milk, well, that's simply crackers. But it's the kind of pseudo-scientific BS that's increasingly pushed by the militant trans lobby and semi-justified by Frankenscience that thinks it's okay to drastically re-engineer people to be what they're not if that's what they want. Now, this particular NHS trust, it should be noted, was the first to relabel breastfeeding as chest feeding in its push to cancel women. Now, given the strength of the trans lobby here in Australia and the explosion of gender dysphoria cases, with vulnerable teenagers being treated with puberty-blocking drugs and even surgery because they believe they've been trapped in the wrong body, we can sadly expect this sort of nonsense to arrive in Australia soon. Now, it's way past time, you've heard me say this before, for a proper review into what we're doing here with vulnerable youngsters in the name of avoiding transphobia. Now, if the trans lobby are so convinced this is the right call, then put their so-called science up against the views of biologists and psychiatrists who are increasingly concerned that we're moving far too quickly down a path of irreversible changes before we look at other options to support vulnerable young Australians. Now, let's face it, we've got all these official inquiries into absolutely everything. Naval shipbuilding today, apprenticeships yesterday, bushfires. We can't have a proper inquiry into the chemical sterilisation of children and all the other extreme measures being justified in the name of trans rights. As with the refusal to have a fair income inquiry into COVID, this is about burying the truth, because there's no doubt left-leaning governments are frightened about what a proper inquiry might actually find. All right, big day there in Canberra with that naval ship review out. Let's go there now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. Peter Dutton has criticised Labor's handling of national security, arguing the government doesn't see it as a priority. Following a fiery sitting week in which Labor's handling of the NZYQ High Court case were front and centre, nearly 40 asylum seekers from Bangladesh and Pakistan were found in remote Western Australia. The opposition says it's Labor's fault.
If you look at the budget papers, which is what we're looking at from the last budget, there is a cumulative impact of $600 million being taken out of Border Force.
We've had a lot of nonsense from Peter Dutton. He's spoken about alleged cuts when there's been a $470 million increase.
Labor insists Operation Sovereign Borders is working and says Peter Dutton is playing a dangerous political game.
What we do not need is politicians running around the country, as Peter Dutton has done, telling outright lies.
Government figures show there's been an undeniable drop in surveillance, with a 20.7% decrease in aerial flying hours and 12.2% fall in maritime patrol days. Border Force says resourcing and ageing patrol boats are to blame.
Labor's funding for Border Force is clearly not adequate.
Defence Minister Richard Marles has announced an $11 billion boost to the Navy fleet. The shake-up will see the number of the Navy's major surface combatants eventually rise from 11 to 26.
An increase in the number of warships in the Royal Australian Navy to being the largest fleet since the end of the Second World War.
Several countries have been briefed on the announcement, and one was even offered to a nation seen as a strategic adversary, China. Queensland's Police Commissioner, Katarina Carroll, has announced her resignation amid mounting pressure over her handling of the state's youth crime crisis.
I'm highly confident that whoever relieves in this role, whoever becomes the Commissioner, is as passionate as I am about keeping Queenslanders safe.
All right, for more on those stories, I'm joined now by Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell in the studio with me in Sydney for a change. You've been, we're just talking there in the package, you've been in the lockup today for this defence review into Navy. Tell us what you made of it all.
Well, the spin is it's 11 warships to 26, but there's, a lot of maybes around it. They're talking about 6 potentially uncrewed vessels which can fire missiles off, but the technology hasn't even been developed yet. The US just has a prototype. So they say once they happen, we'll be able to get some. So that's 6 of your 26. Then they're saying 11 new frigates, but they're saying that's between South Korea, Japan, and a couple other, Spain, and another country. And so there's not so much certainty around them. They're just saying 4 of those by the end of the decade.
You're right.
And they're saying
they've got to make a decision on which one they're going to go with.
Yeah, and they're saying 3 less Hunter class. So really in terms of and 6 less Arafura patrol boats. So what's concrete is what they're cutting. The rest of it, you have to take their word for it, frankly.
And the money too. I mean, I made the point 1.7 is real, $1.7 billion. The gross staff $11.7 billion number. Well, a lot of that's on the never never. Yeah,
the 10-year figures are always concerning. These projects do have long lag times, but the report itself said that they were $25 billion over on the Hunter and other frigate projects. So if you're $25 billion over on those, and you're only putting an extra $11 billion over 10 years, $11.1 billion, it's probably just going to account for, the blowouts, isn't it? If you're lucky.
Greg Sheridan, he's got a line here today, he called it a cross between a damp squib and a huge con job.
It gets into them, Greg.
I thought it was telling that the Prime Minister wasn't at the announcement, because normally PMs, in my experience, for these big-scale defence announcements are there.
Well, he was in Perth, and obviously they're trying to win seats in Perth, and a lot of the construction's in Perth, as it is in South Australia. So he felt he could have something to say there. But there's no doubt that Richard Marles's reputation's now tied to this. No doubt at all. And yet that goes to what you're saying. He really led it.
What about this fight today about the budget on boats, that there's been a reduction of the spending that's in part contributed to a lack of surveillance on our borders? Dueling budget papers on both sides, but it's been a feature of the day, hasn't it?
It has, and look, I don't actually think this is that big a problem yet because it's one boat and they've gone to Nauru. But if you had a couple more, wow, you got a problem. So
it's a scab though with Labor. You know, you're really picking up the scab.
Yeah,
I mean,
so,
people remember this stuff.
Well, that's the issue. But I mean, I remember covering when it was just so out of control, right? Thousands coming. It was crazy. So if I was them, I'd be like saying to my top brass, you be surveilling, you totally put everything into this surveillance effort now because it's going to become a theme if we get another boat here. Their full effort should be into it. It's a political vulnerability, that's for sure.
And I make the point, Tony Burke was an immigration minister, Chris Bowen, the worst record in history. I mean, all these Labor characters that presided over all of those 50,000 arrivals that came under Labor's watch, they're still in the political game. They're still there in Canberra. They're still on the Labor front bench.
Well, I'm old enough to have covered when Howard and Ruddock shut it down, and that was 4,000 a year, and Australians reacted like they all voted in relation to that. That was 4,000 a year. Then when the Labor government, it was 10,000 a year. So now we've got 40 people. So, I mean, I put it in that perspective, but the point is, yeah, they need to hold firm or, yeah, it can start up again easily. And look, even back then in the Howard years, it was people fleeing Afghanistan and Iraq, war-torn countries where they were persecuted. Now this is economic migrants. It's people from Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Yep, India we saw the other day too. Hey, what's this late-breaking news this afternoon about, speculation that there's going to be an early election?
Well, News.com has the story. It's a really intriguing story because it's a story with Tim Gartrell, the Chief of Staff to Anthony Albanese.
Former campaign director for Labor in Kevin 071.
Praising the fact he's about to hire David Epstein, who's a former Kevin Rudd Chief of Staff. And the signal message, and it's pretty hard to leak a signal message or unheard of, talks about how great Epstein is and that it could be an election year. Now, a couple of things on this. One is I note the article goes extensively through David Epstein's record as if, you know, should I say it, David Epstein might have had something to do with this story. But I think also this, I have picked up a bit of static around this year could be an election year. Now, the PM says, no, the terms aren't long enough. We need to go 3 years. But he also said he wasn't going to reverse on the stage 3 tax cuts, did he? And the two dates I'm hearing, Peter, if there was an option, and this doesn't get in the way of Queensland or the US, are November 30 and December 7. So I don't rule that out if their poll numbers are in a reasonable position. Peter Dutton was on Sunday Agenda with me and said there's not an election with 13 months, and I thought at the time, you might not be right there.
What about reshuffle speculation? Because, I mean, I can't see how they survive much longer with Andrew Giles. There's been a bit of speculation that Claire O'Neill wasn't over there for Cabinet in WA. Clearly, Richard Marles wasn't there either. He was in Sydney with this announcement today. What can you tell us?
I think Richard Marles might have gone and flown back, but I need
of course,
to
he's got a RAF plane, of course.
Yeah. I think he might have gone and flown back, which is pretty arduous, really. And he's gone to Adelaide tonight for an event, but in relation to defence. But Claire O'Neill broke her hand playing basketball. That's why the Home Affairs Minister wasn't available. She did that a couple of weeks back. She was seeing a specialist, so she didn't go to the Cabinet. Andrew Giles is struggling. You know, do you want to do a whole Cabinet reshuffle just for 1 or 2 ministers? Well, there is an opening there, and that's retirements. And if you say, let's say we are a year out from an election and not, 10 months or 9 months, someone like Linda Burney retires, there's your opening. So I reckon if it was going to happen, that's going to be the trigger rather than the government handing the opposition a scalp unless they have to.
Andrew Clennell, thank you as always. Great to have you on the desk. All right, as I said, that major shake-up for Navy today announced $11 billion, but as I said, that's not real money. Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, says it's the largest scale-up for the Royal Australian Navy since the end of the Second World War. Well, that's his view. Let's bring in an expert and work out what's fact and what's possibly fiction. Joining me now, Head of Research at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Marcus Hellier. Marcus, thank you for your time. I'll start with the funding. We'll get into the kit that's there on the wish list from the Minister, but this $11 billion spend, we've actually only got a real 1.7. Now, part of the challenge with defence always is secure funding. And we know with the earlier defence review last year, they were sort of borrowing money from robbing Peter to pay Paul. What's your view of the devil in the detail on the funding, please?
Okay, so No government funding is actually guaranteed because our budgets only go for 1 year. So the question is, what certainty has the government given to Defence for long-term planning? So Defence really plans on 10 or even 20-year cycles. So has the government told Defence they can plan on getting that $11.1 billion? And the answer seems to be yes. Of course, a future government can come along and say, we're not going to give you that money, but that applies to any government program. So I think the good news about this announcement today is the government has said it's putting additional money into Defence. Will that be enough for what we have to do? That's a separate question. I think we're in a really, really big hole, and it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money to dig ourselves out from it.
I just spoke with Andrew Clennell about the detail of what's on the table announced today, Hunter-class frigates, etc. But are we getting the ships we need? And how confident are you, given the issue, that $65 billion cost blow we had with those Hunter frigates? Are we getting the right ships? Now, are we scaling them? Are they going to arrive at the right time that we could potentially need them for a conflict to our north?
Well, the truth is we're in a terrible state, and you may not want to hear it, your listeners may not want to hear it, but the previous government shipbuilding plan was an absolute disaster. We spent $4 billion on the French submarines before we realised we didn't want them. We've now spent $2 billion on the offshore patrol vessels before deciding they're not the right ship. And we've spent $4 billion already on the Hunter-class frigates, and we sort of seem to think they're probably not the right ships, but we kind of got to keep going because we've spent $4 billion. So that's the hole we're in. I think on the whole, this new plan is better than the old plan, but it's pretty ambitious. So the Deputy Prime Minister said we're going to try and get new warships by the end of this decade. Well, where we are now, that's only 5 or 6 years away, and that's a pretty racy timeline for new warships. So I think this is better, but a lot of things have to fall into place to actually deliver. A key one is we truly have to go with off-the-shelf ships. That's always been a problem for Defence. It says it wants off-the-shelf, but then it ends up, seeking perfection and redesigning everything from scratch. So it's possible we could do better than the old plan, but there has to be discipline inside Defence.
Well, you and I would go well back beyond that current catalogue of failure from the last government. We can go right back, basically, even to the very early design of the Collins-class submarines. I mean, ministers take advice from the department and all the experts, and of course we have the experts do these reviews and governments implement them. Politicians don't say, this boat over that boat. They take the recommendation, as I say, from the Defence Department. When are we ever going to see, Marcus, heads roll in the Defence Department for recommendations that they've put to governments of both sides of politics that have been so far away from what we need, and we literally waste tens of billions of dollars for those same defence bureaucrats to come back and tell the next government, we made a mistake, they're not the right ones, we've got to go down this path. Where's the accountability?
Well, Peter, that is my favourite question. Where is the accountability? So that failed shipbuilding plan that I just quickly ran through, that was based entirely on advice from Defence. Defence got exactly what it asked for from the government, and here we are down the track, having spent $10 billion not getting what we wanted. Have any heads rolled? I think the answer is no. We saw it last week at estimates with the terrible situation where we now have commanding one of the Army's brigades, or second in command, an accused Fijian human rights perpetrator. And the chief of the Defence Force sat there and said, well, we didn't do due diligence and I'm accountable. Where are the heads rolling? So we see it all the way across Defence. And I don't think there will be improvements in the quality of advice to government from Defence until heads do start to roll. I
couldn't agree more, Mark Atelier. Thank you for your time. All right, after the break, more on the growing security concerns about visas being issued to people claiming Palestinian citizenship. These are to come to Australia, and some are being waved through in just 24 hours. Plus, you won't believe the latest madness out of the UK. Lactation for biological men. We'll have more to say on that shortly. Welcome back. Still to come, not content with dictating what we can drive, the Albanese government will soon issue new guidelines about what you can eat, not merely for its nutritional value, but also climate impact. That's being measured now as well. But first, matters of national security, both domestic and abroad, under this current government are certainly worrying. Joining me now, Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Patterson. James, thank you for your time. I know you've just come back from the Munich Security Conference. We'll get to some international issues in a moment, but a big debate today about the budget available to Home Affairs to defend our enormous coastline. The opposition picked up on changes with the budget. Claire O'Neill comes out today, she's the minister, saying, look, we've got plenty of funds there and you and Peter Dutton are just playing funny buggers. But we also hear she's putting a bid into the budget committee wanting to put more money in the May budget. So clearly there's something going on here. The Border Force Commissioner Michael Ottram says there's no budget cuts, everything's okay, but you quietly picked up what the budget papers actually say, and it's very different than what the minister's telling us, isn't it?
That's right, Peter. On the one hand, we could take what the minister says, but this is a minister who got wrong the funding for her own cybersecurity strategy on the day she announced it. So we probably won't do that. Or we could take the budget papers as the truth. And the budget papers are very clear, and she can go and ask Jim Chalmers about it if she's confused. It shows the funding for this year, and then the funding declining for every year for the next forward estimates. And cumulatively, that adds up to $600 million. Now, Labor's argument here is just ignore the budget papers, don't worry about that, that's not our intention. Well, what is the purpose of budget papers and forward estimates if it's not to indicate the government's priorities and where it intends to spend money? And if they are going to find this money, well, where's it going to come from? What other programs are going to be cut, or what other taxes are going to be increased to fund it here? It's very clear, funding for Border Force and Border Protection falls. And this is a government that's also done other things to undermine our border security, like abolishing temperature protection visas and failing to deliver the maritime surveillance hours that we need, which, no surprise, has led to 2 boats now slipping through.
This has got to be a link, though, doesn't it, James? This reduction in the budget funding for border protection, perhaps in the hope we'd get away with it, no one would notice it. Of course, we have the boats turn up, and then this story appears today, clearly a leak from the government, that the minister's going to go in there and thump the table at the ERC budget rounds, that she's going to put more money in the May budget. But this is catch-up money. This is them being caught out as these boats are starting up again.
That's right, Peter. Michael Ottram admitted to me in Senate estimates in October last year that they weren't meeting their maritime surveillance objectives. And the minister has only announced that she'll be seeking more money in the upcoming budget today after it hits the media. You know how unusual it is to foreshadow a budget announcement that hasn't even been approved by ERC, let alone considered by ERC yet. This is scrambling and panic from the government because it knows it's in trouble, because it's had 2 boats on its watch slip past and reach the Australian mainland. That is almost unheard of in the last decade. It is such a rare event. They're almost always intercepted at sea and turned around. But these ones have slipped through. That's happened on this government's watch, and they have to account for it.
I spoke to David Adler last night from the Jewish Australian Lobby about something that we've followed now for many months, and this is this spike in visas from people who identify as having Palestinian citizenship. But you and Claire Chandler actually unearthed this detail last week in Senate estimates, because DFAT has revealed they've granted around 2,000 visitor visas, 148 other migration and temporary visas to people who say they've got Palestinian citizenship. Now, what's worrying here for me is, A, we don't have any consular services, Australian consular services in Gaza, fair enough, but these applications have been approved, some of them, in just 24 hours. Now, given also that some of these are online application forms, how confident are we, James Patterson, that the appropriate checks are being done?
Peter, I wish I could say I had confidence, but based on the answers that officials from Home Affairs gave me last week in Senate estimates, I can't say that I am. You're right, it's now more than 2,000 visas granted to Palestinian residents in a very short period of time. Let's remember, this is a war zone controlled by a terrorist organisation. I don't know how we could be doing adequate checks on the ground of those people. So essentially we're relying on the documentation they provide online and taking it at face value. And not only did they say that on average these visas are approved in 24 hours, they conceded it was possible that in at least one case, a visa was granted in a single hour. Now, how on earth is it possible to do any security checks at all if it is being turned around in just 1 hour? I'm deeply concerned that at very least among these 2,000 people will be sympathisers and political supporters of Hamas, which frankly I think is bad enough and we wouldn't want in our country, let alone the risk that actually there are people who have direct terrorist associations in that group, which is of course a risk when you're dealing with a jurisdiction like this.
And if the government in Gaza, and it is a government that they elected, is a Hamas-controlled government, if you want to verify identity, if you want to check any details or bona fides of people, I mean, do you get a piece of paper from Hamas to say who they are, or does it come from the Palestinian authorities? And of course, we've got grave concerns. Look at the UNRWA funding. Money that moves through the Palestinian authorities is also suspect. So, I mean, where do you get the veracity checks that you need before you allow someone to come to Australia?
There's no comforting answer to that question, Peter. It either is that documents are generated by Hamas, a terrorist organisation, or documents are generated by the Palestinian Authority, a corrupt organisation which has not governed in Gaza for nearly 20 years and has no authority or presence on the ground. So there is no way you can have assurance on any documents that have been provided or about the identities of these people, let alone their terrorist associations or sympathies. And I think the government has been incredibly reckless by rushing through so many applications in such a short period of time with such little checks. And the implications this could have for our safety and security or our social cohesion are very profound.
Talk to me about the Munich Security Conference, because while you were away at this conference, I'm interested in your observations from other people that you caught up with, and also the agenda for the conference. I mean, what are some of the big concerns that were being raised? But also you were there, obviously, when we heard the news about Alexei Navalny over the weekend. What was the reaction there from the international community?
The sentiment at the conference was very sober, Peter, because of the announcement about Alexei Navalny's death and the fact that his wife Yulia addressed the conference within hours of his death being announced. That was a very sombre and sober moment. But also because there is recognition that the Ukraine war is in a very difficult phase, that Ukraine is under great strain and great stress from Russia and its allies, including North Korea, and its financial and economic sponsors and supporters, including China. And Russia is now significantly outproducing Ukraine and its allies on things like shells for artillery, and that is having real battlefield implications, which has led Ukraine, for example, in the last 48 hours to withdraw from Advika, a town which they were fighting very hard to defend for months and months and months. It's very clear that Ukraine needs more support from the Western world, from the European Union, from the United States, from Australia, from other partners, because if they don't get that support, then they will suffer further losses and Russia will make further gains. And that is not in our interest. It's not in anyone's interest. We need to make sure that Russia is defeated here in Ukraine and this war doesn't become an even wider one, which is at great risk. The Baltic states and Poland could very easily be the next, and that would, of course, bring NATO into the conflict in a much more direct way, which I don't think anyone should welcome.
James, just before we go, news in the papers this morning that I read, one of the 149 foreign criminals released in Sydney has been charged with a failure to report back to Home Affairs as is required. So he fronts a magistrate, but they then released him on bail. Now, if the problem is he's not turning up and reporting in when he should, why does he get bail?
I'm really concerned about this, Peter, and I challenged the Australian Federal Police on this last week at estimates, and they weren't able to answer my question. I said, what position is the AFP taking in court on whether or not these people should be granted bail after they've breached their visa conditions? They weren't able to answer that question. Of course, the position should be no bail if you're breaching your visa conditions, because let's remember, these are people who had their visas taken away and were incarcerated because of other crimes they're already accused of and have now gone and breached their bail again. So it's at least 2 strikes, if not 3 in these cases, and they do pose a very real risk to the community. And that is why it is so shocking that the Albanese government has still not applied for one single preventative detention order, the Parliament rushed through before Christmas to protect the community. What on earth are they waiting for? How many more crimes need to be committed before they're going to act?
Shocking, James Patterson, thank you. I don't know about you, my dear audience, but I tell you what, I'd feel a lot more safe if he was in charge of Home Affairs and not the Labor Party at the moment. But, well, we need an election for that, don't we? Let's go back to the madness, though. I mentioned at the top of the show, a group of health officials in the United Kingdom. So these are government officials. They are now claiming that milk produced by transgender women, so biological men, with the help of drugs, of course, is just as good for babies as natural female breast milk. The leaked letter from the University of Sussex Hospital's NHS Trust insists the term they need to use, we have to use, they say, human milk. and it's meant to be gender neutral and says that milk from trans women is, quote, comparable to that produced following the birth of a baby. Joining me now to discuss this, someone I know who is as passionate about this issue as me, a former Liberal MP, Nicole Flint. Well, I mean, this let's remember, was the first hospital really to go out there and use the term chest feeders. Nicole, what do you make of this?
Peter, this is beyond belief. I genuinely do not understand how these doctors are allowed to be doing this and who has allowed them to do it. They're giving biological men a range of drugs so that they can chest feed newborn babies. So essentially, the medical profession and these individuals are experimenting on babies. Government needs to step in. I don't know how government hasn't stepped in. And if we go back to first principles, and as our viewers know, I don't often quote the United Nations, but they have declarations and conventions on the protection of children. And they have them because the United Nations and the world and governments around the world recognise that because of children's physical and mental immaturity, they deserve a special level of care and protection. And that protection, according to the United Nations and all of the countries like Australia who have adopted this, applies before birth and after birth. So we need to see governments starting to do their jobs and protecting children.
So why don't we have an inquiry? When we just knocked one off, well, we did knock one off. The Premier in South Australia knocked one off. Pauline Hanson tried to get one up federally. Some Liberals voted for it. Other Liberals walked out of the room and abstained. There was an attempt in Victoria by our good friend Moira Deeming. Again, if everyone in the trans lobby is so certain that what they are doing is right, that this is the best course, chest feeding is the best action to go down that path, then let's have an inquiry, because more and more doctors in Australia, Nicole, psychiatrists, biologists, they're actually unsure. And you look around the world, they're all coming back from where we are now, but we seem to be going hell for leather.
That's right. We absolutely need an inquiry. I think it should be a federal government inquiry. The Labor Party could do this tomorrow. We can do it in a very respectful way. We can do it in a careful way. And we should have both sides of the debate represented and both sides of the medical profession, because as you've just pointed out, there are national and international experts who are deeply concerned about how gender dysphoria in children is being treated. And we should at the same time, or perhaps in a separate inquiry, but why not look at the full picture? So gender dysphoria in children, but then also this phenomenon or this experimental treatment of inducing lactation or so-called lactation in biological men. And Peter, I would also say, has anybody, or I would ask and put into such an inquiry, has anyone done a study on the impact of unborn babies born to transgender men who are biologically female, take a range of medications to turn themselves or attempt to turn themselves into men, and then carry a baby? Like this, I am so concerned that this is going to be the next class action against governments, but also taxpayers who will ultimately foot the bill for a generation of kids who have not been looked after by governments and by the health system when they are precisely our citizens that we owe the highest duty of care to.
I mentioned Moira Deeming a little bit earlier on, and we know that she is suing John Pizzuto, the Victorian Liberal leader, for defamation. And this goes all the way back to her fronting and speaking in defence of women's rights at a rally in Melbourne. What do you make of the fact, and she's not getting party money or anything like that to fund her defamation case, what did you make of the revelations over the weekend that Victorian Liberal leaders, former premiers in this case, Jeff Kennett, Ted Baillieu, Dennis Napthine, are all joining the fight against Moira Deeming?
I am so disappointed, Peter. You know, all the work that I've done to try and support and encourage women to join the Liberal Party, to put their hand up for leadership positions, to put their hand up to become candidates in the lower house, the upper house, all of the incredible work you've done over the years to support women like me, women who are political advisors, staffers, you know, getting women to become leaders in the Liberal Party, and then you see this happen. Like, honestly, this is the old boys club out in force. I am disgusted, quite frankly. I am so disappointed with what Moira Deeming has been put through purely because she went to a rally to stand up for women, which is precisely what we want to see women doing. And Peter, as you and I are well aware, she has such enormous grassroots support. So I would just implore the former Liberal premiers in Victoria and the current opposition leader to come to their senses and drop this. Let's all get past this. Let's welcome Moira back into the party room because she is a strong Liberal woman. She is still a Liberal woman despite everything she's been put through. She has incredible support. She's doing great work for women and children and her community, and I really hope this can still be resolved.
So do I, but I think John Pizzuto will not be the Liberal leader at the next election. I don't expect he'll be the Liberal leader even by the end of the year. This stuff has bitten so hard in the Victorian Party, and I have known that party for 30 years, so we'll see what happens. Nicole, thank you for your time. All right, after the break, with record migration, are you surprised to hear that the percentage of our population now born overseas is double that of the UK and the US? Now, the rapid rise is staggering, more coming up, plus how the Putin-Navalny issue is playing out in the US presidential race. And I'll get you the latest on Julian Assange. All right, let's bring you my panel for tonight. Plenty of international news to get across. Joining me now, Sky News contributor Kosha Garda, former Labor MP Michael Danby. Well, welcome to you both. I'm in Sydney tonight, but good to have you on the screen as always. Let's start with migration. Last year, we took in over 1 million long-term and permanent arrivals, the largest intake, of course, in Australia's history by a long mile. And that sort of influx changes statistics dramatically, as a new report from the Institute of Public Affairs has revealed, with around 31% now of Australia's population listed as born overseas. According to the most recent comparable data from 2020, this is now double the amount in the US and UK and the highest of any other nation in the Anglosphere. Now, yes, it's staggering, Michael. We're in the middle of a housing and cost of living crisis, but I'm also focused on the integration of such a big volume of people in Australia. Are we sure they're signed up to our values?
First of all, guten Morgen aus Berlin, Peter and Kosha, and all your audience. I'm not sure. I think it's too many. Peter, people across the political spectrum have been supporters of migration for its skills, for its adding to Australia's youth and for its cultural vitality, but it sounds too many. I think we need to go a bit slower and let the numbers be absorbed and people be integrated more comprehensively. I think that's the only way of getting support for migration is to see that the Australian people feel that it's under their control.
And look, I think I absolutely agree with that point there. It's almost like the digestion rate of a country, if I can call it that, Kosha. If you put 1 million people into somewhere like the United States with its 370 million plus, those people will integrate, I think, quite adequately. But you put 1 million into a population of Australia, that's a lot of people, and it's a lot of people quickly, isn't it?
It sure is, Peter. I think that is one of the biggest open secrets of the immigration debate, which really is the issue of our time, because, as you stated there, the levels, the quantum of immigration is ahistorical in terms of just what's coming into liberal democracies, but certainly Australia, given the low baseline population to begin with. And one of the biggest determinants of assimilation is the quantum of people coming in, because there's no magic wand for assimilation where you just arrive on the soil and you automatically integrate into the value system over here. It's human nature. It's very natural for people to stick in their comfort zone. And when there's enough of a critical mass of people coming in, the incentive to assimilate just goes away. Not because they're bad people, but that's just how human nature generally works. And so I really think that this issue is reaching a fever pitch, and something like a scaled back or even a moratorium for 5 years or what have you to test how that works. And if we see some actual shifts, might be forthcoming, because it does look like that's what the people increasingly want.
Michael, talk to me about this push to basically declare a unilateral move to declare a Palestinian state, because Israel, quite rightly, is pushing back against it.
3 times American presidents, Clinton, Bush Jr. and Obama got the Palestinians to the table, and they each of the 3 times, it's documented in Bill Clinton's biography, ran away from the possibility of a Palestinian state. So they're the ones who are against a Palestinian state on terms that would be fair to both sides. So you're forcing on them something that they have historically opposed and won't agree to. The real problem is, like post-war Germany, denazification. You've got to have a re-education of people for democratic values, to live alongside people, and then to give them some political horizon for a solution where they can express their own sovereignty. But you can't do that if people are educated by UNRWA to come across the border and rape, murder and pillage. That's their mentality, because that's what they've been taught year after year after year in the West Bank and Gaza.
Just quickly, Kosha, this whole issue with Putin, and we've seen the resurgence now with the I think it's the murder of Navalny over the weekend. How's it all playing out in the US election?
It is very interesting because, it's on the one hand, a flashpoint in this war, and support among the U.S. population for U.S. involvement in the war has been steadily declining. That's just the harsh reality for many, many reasons, not because they morally don't support the Ukrainian effort for having their sovereignty protected, but they just don't want U.S. involvement. This is sort of giving new oxygen into that and sort of highlighting the types of people that we're dealing with here, actors on the world stage, and why we have to stand up for it. The other equally important dynamic that's happening is it's showcasing, certainly in the Republican base, this connection that they're drawing between what happened with Navalny and what's happening to Trump. Obviously, you can't equate somebody being killed with legal fines, but the point of having your political opposition jailed or harassed legally, that's getting a lot of oxygen as well. So you see these two dynamics on a collision course, and it's intersecting right within the Republican and Democrat establishments as well as nationally. So buckle up. I think it's going to get messier.
Michael, we're almost out of time, but Chance Uram on Julian Assange, do you think he'll be extradited to the United States? He's in his final hearing stage. What do you think is going to happen?
I think he will. I think the American establishment and Biden, backed by former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, haven't cracked, because some of the things that Assange did are not very popular to talk about, but are not simply the release of information about military activities. They were some people were convicted in court in the United States of leaking information to him that ruined Hillary Clinton's campaign because she was considered too anti-Russian.
All right, we'll leave it there. I might add the reason why there is delays is that Julian Assange has pushed and profited and created those delays. So, yes, I don't want him. I want him to face justice. I want him to face a court, and if he's innocent, well, that will be borne out in the court. Thank you both for your time. See you next week. Coach out there, Michael Danby. All right, that's it for me. Back tomorrow night at 6. Look forward to your company then. Here's Andrew Bolt.